This is the third presentation in art, and art is the second phase of the second year. We need to keep track of a geometricity which is operating for us. Our traditional sense of experience has a different pattern from the pattern of experience when it is related. A narrated experience always has a linearity, always. So that there is such a thing in literature, either written or oral. There is such a thing in literature as a narrative line. And the critical term narrative line is actually an expression of what was meant by the original Greek word mythos, myth. And language is a process rather than an object that can be manipulated. It's a process that can be channeled. You cannot pick language up by the scruff of the neck. You have to entice or coax. You have to put a rudder and a sail in language in order to navigate and go where you want to go. And if you know how to navigate, then language can take you to many realms. When language comes into being, it always comes into being in terms of a narrative line. Why is this so? This is so because, and here's a little purple box phrase that you key in as an index word. Numeracy precedes literacy. Human beings, in their societal mode, in their sociological caste, learn to count before they learn to discursively speak. Numeracy precedes literacy. Now, a written language, a language with either an alphabet or hieroglyphic characters, a written language is not much more than about 5,000 years old. But a written numeracy is older than that. Just one little example. We know now from archaeological digs in what today is Bosnia-Herzegovina, ex-Yugoslavia, that there were mining operations and metallurgical operations there, some 6,500 BC. That's 8,500 years ago. 3,500 years before there was a written language of any kind, Chinese, Egyptian, Sumerian, you name it. Those mining, refining, metallurgical processes were carried through a numerical designation. And only later did the literate language, did literacy come into play. And literacy as a content methodology filled in the numerical form, the process form. So a narrative line actually falls into a distributive form that was made originally by counting. 1, 2, 3, ta-da, ta-da, ta-da. So that the narrative line, the natural, integral way in which language forms itself, is to have this kind of a development. But we know from observing children, or even earlier, observing babies, or animals, or observing ourselves when we are reduced to infantile levels, that experience comes out as confusion in terms of the narrative line of expectation. It's not that experience is confused, but in terms of a narrative line, the experience of animals, infants, inebriated adults, transcendent yogic geniuses, all of them live in a childlike, suspended realm where the narrative line does not take place. The cookie cutter does not descend upon the field of experience and deliver to it any kind of countable development. And so we call this, or it has been called, a dream world, a dream time, a mystical milieu. And when one falls into this realm, the term that has been used most apt in the 20th century comes from Lucien Levy-Bruhl, popularized by Carl Jung, and now has settled into the natural language. And naturally, because it's French as a phrase, I can't pronounce it correctly. Participation mystique. One falls into a mystical participation with what? With nature. With nature. And we saw in the first year of our education that nature is the most primordial of all phases. And in its primordiality, it is characterized by zeroness. You cannot count on nature. Nature is there before countability even comes into play. So that the foundation, what would be the bedrock of experience, turns out not to be bedrock, but magma. Nature, rather than being a thing, rather than being solid, is a state of material which has no properties in common with solids. And to characterize it as liquid or as gaseous is also inappropriate. Nature has, indeed, a very interesting quality. Its quality is a state of matter known as plasma. So that the quality of nature as a plasma is that it is never quite there. It is never quite what one would need it to be, or expect it to be, or want it to be. It's always in this state, and we characterize nature then as a matrix of change. And when we began the course a year and a half ago, we used the I Ching to characterize for ourselves a ceaseless, endless process. Not only endless, but boundless in that it has no beginning. It has no starting point. But because it has no starting point, it simply means that it has no oneness. It has no unity. It has no thusness. Nature has instead a boundlessness. It has a zero rather than a one quality. And the only place in this universe where objectivity obtains, where something becomes a solid, is when an action happens, when something pragmatic occurs. For us, it's when we do something. The doing of it objectifies. So that existence has a dynamic and objective quality to it at all times, frequently symbolized by an arrow. And that this arrow has a quality which we call in mathematics of a vector. Now for us, the vector has to start somewhere. It has to have a beginning. And so the arrow for us always begins with a dot. And you can extend that line as long as you want. You can make any kind of arrow, head. But in nature, there are no vectors that have beginning dots. They all begin with a zero-ness. And so perhaps the most apt phrase taken from the I Ching is that nature, if we wish to characterize it in language, is a Tao. It's a zero-based quality. And that this is an intelligence about reality which can be carried all the way through into consciousness. And for instance, one of the qualities that is there in advanced mentality is the realization that computers of the 21st century and on, ever after that, will be founded on algorithmic processes that have a zero base. One of the class members was good enough to Xerox off some of the writings of Edgar Dijkstra, who is developing now the zero-base algorithms for computers of the future, at least 2 generations ahead of what is out there now. But eventually, intelligence will move that way because it is real. And because the resolution of what is real is, oddly enough, is curiously enough, enhanced by using a zero base rather than an initial expected objective one quality. The oneness is indeed, in terms of the real, a flaw. Not that the one is illusory, not at all. It's just that it does not begin. Now, the implications of this character of nature are that experience has no beginning also. Experience has no beginning. And so it recommends a beginning. It options a beginning. It designates a beginning in terms of some selective action sequence. And so a narrative line always has its coherence in terms of the beginning. So one looks for a narrative line to always be a special case of the universe. It is always, in each and every instance, a special case of the universe, which is why they're so interesting. Now, this special case of the universe, being the narrative line, being an experiential content that is essentially zero-based, but allows itself, as nature allows itself, to be distributed into a countable, a narrative line that can be counted in an order, in a sequence, in a linearity. So that all storylines unfold themselves from some definite, certain beginning through whatever complications to some conclusion. And a satisfying story is always that the beginning and the ending have an understood quality of being within parentheses. That all of this was absolutely true, but that whole statement is within parentheses. This added quality is known in high culture as comedy. The kind of comedy of William Faulkner, the kind of comedy of Aristophanes, of Balzac, of Dante. Dante's epic is not called the Divine Tragedy, it's called the Divine Comedy. Balzac's whole works are La Comédie Humaine. Someone asked Faulkner why he wrote such tragic novels, and he said, my dear, they're all a comedy. Why? Because of the parenthetical truth, which allows then even the most tragic line to be accepted by a universe that is totally free and able to change, to transform whatever it was into something new, into something else. So that the narrative line of experience, the numerical development of integration, in order in its own terms to be true, must have a definite beginning and a definite end. But in terms of its relation to what really is, it has to surrender all of that to the unknown. And that's why there is such a thing as realization in this universe. That's why transformation is real. Were this not the case, were the universe to begin somewhere with a oneness, transformation would be an illusion, realization would be a delusion, and there would be no possibility for God, even imaginatively, and there would be no salvation for us. So the implications are very large. Indeed, they're magnanimous in terms of the gifts of possibility. What's important for us is that in the first year of our education, we saw that this whole cycle of integration has a career that begins in nature, achieves its existence in what we call the action phase, doing something, which is the realm of ritual. Rituals make existence objective. It makes the specific instance true. But the ultimate career of that specific instance, the ultimate career of it, is to give itself up again to the universe, to surrender itself. To surrender itself for what purpose? To be reabsorbed by the zero-based all. And so this quality of nature and ritual carries over into experience, into myth. The first phase is nature, the second ritual, the third myth. And by that time, the process of nature and the process of language have both done their magical plasma dance. And just as nature allows its plasma to take form in action, language allows its plasma to take form as mind. And in a way which would satisfy the most outrageously stubborn Kantian philosopher, the mind is as real as any object in existence. Now, the plasma vehicle that carries language, that founds the mind, is the neural system. Not just the brain, but the brain, the spinal column, the nerves, the whole neural system. The whole neuronal field is the plasma. And so it's quite according to expectation then that a close, one almost might say instead of microbiological, a a nanobiological look at the neural processes show the characteristics of a plasma field. The plasma physics applies to the way in which a neural system works. Very, very similar. Remarkably similar. It has given rise to a lot of metaphors about how the universe must indeed be conscious, the conscious universe. What's important for us is that as the mind becomes objectively real, as thought has its forms which crystallize out of experience, they take on a kind of a paired resonance with existence in terms of the entities and objects of existence. So that the forms of thought have a correlational quality with the forms of existence. T.S. Eliot, in his poetic theories, came up with a beautiful term in his essays in the 1930s. He called it the objective correlative. And he said, all great poetry is written by beings who have come to understand that these two together form a tuning fork. Now, this tuning fork allows for us to pitch and to perfect into some kind of numerically ratioable, distributable, sequential formation of what otherwise would be the nebulous mystery of experience or of nature. It allows, for instance, the infinite possibilities of sound to become music in terms of a scale. And so in mathematical terms, we use the term scalar, that there is a scalar quality to the numerical ratios that are possible. And knowing this does not cage us in some kind of tyrannical big brotherhood, but frees us then to have an expressive way of utilizing the mystery of life into infinite, unique, special cases of expression, which then carry themselves through to this release point of going back into the flow. Now, once something has existed, once something has had existence, and that existence has been highlighted and underlined by a mind form, it's like an alignment, two objectivities. These two objectivities, this alignment, falls into the universal form that allows for another objective phase to happen in this alignment, a third aligned phase. What we're talking about in this section of the course is the third objective phase, and this phase is the phase of art. So that ritual, symbols, and art are family members. They're all objective stages. And when they're aligned, they work really. They really work. Let's say it again, it's sort of like a palindrome. They really work, they work really. Faulkner once said, and I've mentioned it a couple of times, that he stopped writing potboilers when he realized that characters cast shadows. That when literature is done right, when the ritual and the symbol are aligned with the art, the characters that one writes about are as real as any human beings who have ever lived. Don Quixote is as real as any man who ever lived in the golden age of Cervantes and Chaucer. Indeed, when Tennessee Williams, in one of his great visionary qualities, wrote the play, it's pronounced Camino Real, the Royal Road, but he liked the American pronunciation, Camino Real. He has literary characters mixed with historical figures together in this kind of limbo area where they're waiting, like in the film Casablanca, they're waiting for a plane that takes them out to reality. And it only stops every once in a while, and everyone else is waiting, like in the film in Casablanca, and trying to buy their way out. And there's Don Quixote and Camille, along with other people who were historically real, but they're all together. And indeed, on that level, and what is that level? That level is vision. On the visionary level, it used to be called magic. On the magical level, in the magical universe, all of us exist together. For vision is aligned with nature, with myth, and there's vision as the third. So nature, myth, and vision are family members. Getting your camera down. There we are. Looks like Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, right? Well, kids, that's a science experiment for today. Hope to see you next week. It's a quality that we need to keep in mind, because in art, really great works of art, world-class works of art, all have a peculiar tone and a peculiar taste. They have the taste of an ultimate alignment, and they have a tone of a consonance. It's unmistakable. For instance, one of the techniques that we use in our education to allow for us to be aware and finally conscious of this long distributive continuity, which is so difficult for us to realize in the modern world. In the modern world, we're all regulated by traffic patterns that have stoplights that bunch us up all the time. And we live episodically from one gulp to another. And we don't have a smooth, even, distributed quality of existence, or a smooth, even, distributed quality of experience. And we live from one clot to another. And as soon as there's any kind of obstruction, everybody falls into a swampy area behind it. In order to mitigate that, we have many qualities structurally in our education to help us to become aware in the first year and to become conscious in the second year, that all of the qualities that we need to be free, to have boundless variability, and to ensure that realization is truthful in the sense that it actually happens, we need to relax this clotted, glutted, stoplighted mishmash and allow for this smoother continuity to obtain. And one of the techniques is that for each of the 2 years, we have a work which we read a few pages every day during the whole year. Because the linearity of a book includes within it a transformed structure which allows for that linearity to transform. Now let me explain this a little bit, because I think it's difficult to follow this without understanding. The true name of a book is the Latin term codex. And before 2,000 years ago, there were no codexes. Books did not exist. Books came in the last change of the aeons. The last time there was an aeonic change, books were the symbol of the change. the codex was the realization of a change. What was the change? The change was that the linearity of a narrative numberable sequence can include within it a twist which allows for the narrative line to go through a transformation. And the symbol for that, hermetically, was the infinity sign. The infinity sign is a linearity which does not interrupt itself, it does not ever stop, it does not ever become nonlinear, but it has a kind of a twist in it that allows for it to recursively come back and braid itself through, and thus an infinity sign is the occult symbol for a codex. And the codex was developed, incidentally, by Hellenistic Judaism and utilized by early Christianity. But so that the Christians nor the Jews become too huffy about it, the first person to ever perfect the codex was a pagan Roman named Cicero. And because Cicero won many great law cases on the basis of it, he kept it as a professional secret while he was alive. Cicero would have such complicated legal arguments that nevertheless held in terms of specific development of precedent of Roman law, which is about as linear a thinking as you're ever going to get. The Romans are not artistes. The Romans were builders, they were engineers, and Roman law is about as blocky as you can get. If you didn't get to A, you're not going to get to B. And if you got to F, then you can get to G, but not any further. You can only go one block at a time. So Cicero's use of the private little crib notes in a codex form allowed him to keep the linearity of Roman law within such a complex development, because with the codex you don't just read it straight through. You can if you want to, but you can cross-reference and you can index it. And Cicero's little index notes, the back of his little pocket crib notes, allowed him in Roman courts to hold his little codex crib note alongside him like a personal computer. And he could keep the arguments absolutely true in terms of Roman law and precedent, but he could move that line in such recursive ways that nobody could follow it close enough to be able to argue with him with any effectiveness. And when he was finished, everyone could understand that he was right, but how he was right, one was never quite sure. I tell you this because it's a historical truth. Cicero was the greatest lawyer of all time. In order to found the tyranny of the Roman Empire, they had to make sure that they killed Cicero first. They didn't worry about the Roman people. They worried about the one man, because that one man could have defeated them single-handedly. And so when Roman tyranny wanted to make sure that everyone understood that there was no protector left, after they murdered Cicero, they cut off his hands. And they nailed these hands to the podium in the Senate so that people could see that there was no more gesture of Republican freedom left in Rome. Not that there weren't several million other men who were capable of speaking, but there was no one capable of speaking in this particular way. Cicero was the developer of the Codex. But it was the Hellenistic Jews in Alexandria who realized that the Codex was a phenomenal development in consciousness. And so a writer named Philo developed the Codex form in such a way that one came to have a mind which had the structure and the form of a codex rather than the structure and form of a scroll. Because all written language up to that point was always in terms of either lines drawn, first of all, on cylinder seals, Near East cylinder seals that have the impressions in such a way that the only way that you can read them is to take the cylinder and roll it out, or turn the cylinder and read it in that way. And that was the origin of the way in which written language followed its convolution, and its convolution was always circular. And so the development of the narrative line always had a circular quality. And so there came to be associated in the mind a sense that really sound arguments have a circularity. And that came to be posited in a very odd way as the Aristotelian syllogism, where you have a starting point and you have a development and then you have a conclusion. And that it always follows in that numerical sequential way. And that if you take the middle term out, the first and the last terms have a kind of equivalent quality. And so the designation of the term identity was that A equals A. This is a fatal flaw. Intelligence cannot work with that particular encodification of the plasma of language and achieve any kind of integration worthy of its name. You cannot. And so the first thing that someone does in the higher levels of integration is to convince you to junk your previous education. Forget about what you thought that you knew. Forget about what you learned. And so the very first responsibility of a wisdom teacher was always to confuse the students. Because as long as you have the arrogance and the egotistical certainty that you know already, you will never know. And so there has to be this kind of confusion. But the confusion is a creative blessing. It's what's known in Middle Eastern mythological parlance as the paradox of the fortunate fall. It's paradoxical, but highly fortunate that you fell. Because you fell from a ledge of egotism into the free fall of freedom and discovered that you had wings and you didn't need to fall at all, that you could fly, and that perched on that egotistical ledge of that false certainty was an alien stranding of your being that was unnecessary in the first place. Like the bird that has to be pushed out of the nest sometimes so that it will learn that it has wings and can fly, and that, yes, it can go back to the nest whenever it wishes, but it can also fly. Now, knowing about the nest is very secure and very happy, but there's poor feeding if you stay in the nest. Whereas if you learn to fly, you can feed to your heart's delight and still come back to the nest. All this is a way of saying that when we're beginning to talk about art in these higher conscious levels, you need to keep track of the context in which this is happening. That we've already talked about nature for 3 months. We've already talked about ritual for 3 months. We've talked about myth for 3 months. We've talked about symbols for 3 months. We've talked about vision for 3 months. And now we're spending 3 months talking about art. And we're not just talking about pretty things or not so pretty things that are still pretty. We're not talking on that level at all. We're going in deep enough so that you can make an application for yourself in any way that you wish, to any extent of veracity that you expect. That's what a good education does. It allows you to have that freedom and that quality, but it can only happen with a sense of that continuity. And to the extent that you interrupt that continuity, what happens? A natural regression sets in. Now, the first regression goes back to the previous phase. And very often the previous phase to something like art or something like symbols or something like ritual, the previous phase is always a plasma process. And so there's no way to have any kind of certainty there because there never was a certainty there. It wasn't based on certainty. Now in ritual, if you fall back into nature, not much happens other than the fact that you become beatific. And so falling from existence into nature is not a very bad fall at all. But when you regress from the mind, you regress back into myth. Now, if myth has been handled in a mature way, if the culture is still fairly pure, if the tribe is intact, if your way of approaching it was very integral and very natural, that's not so bad either. But when you live in a polyglot culture, when you live in an alienated, fractured tribalism, 500 warring gangs instead of one people, then the mythic level becomes a pool of piranhas. And everything there jeopardizes you. Everything. Instead of being life-giving water, it becomes a corrosive acid. And so the regressive tendency goes back another phase in order to not stay there in the acid. And so when we fall out of mind, if we fall back into the pleasantries of a highly knit, integrated tribal culture, that's very secure and that's not so bad. But in our situation, the mythic level is an acid. It's rather like sulfuric acid. And so we continue the regression all the way back to the ritual stage. And the ritual stage is always symbolized by the body. And so when one falls out of the mind, one tends in a polyglot cultural situation to fall back to the body. So that showing up at gyms with designer tote bags full of athletic, calisthenic equipment is like very, very satisfying. Wow, gonna really do it. No more of that. But when one comes to existence in this regressive way, one carries a kind of a radiation. One carries a negative charge back to it. And so instead of all of the evolutionary qualities that the body usually has, they go the other way in a counter way and they become de-evolutionary. And the devolving always tends to head back towards what? Back towards nature. So it seems all right. It seems like it's going to be okay. But nature, Mother Nature, is very fastidious. She doesn't allow for this kind of negative charge to come into her electromagnetic spectrum. There is a negative universe, a magnetoelectric spectrum, but it's on the higher end. It's out there in the cosmos, way, way beyond realization. But Mother Nature, in this particular universe, doesn't like the negative charge regression, so she doesn't allow us back in. What was the way it was phrased? That the gate of Eden is guarded by an angel with a flaming sword. back suckers. So you get caught into a kind of a livid ping pong game of being attracted by nature and not invited by nature, and yet you're there in the body that's supposed to be natural, but it never quite gets there, and it can't go forward because you've been there, and that's terrible. I came, I saw, I fled. I don't know what that turns out in Latin, but it probably doesn't rhyme, right? Shades of Julius. But you can't go back to nature. And so one gets trapped in this kind of limbo where you do not allow yourself to use language in any kind of concerted way that would lead to integration, that would develop mind. And you cannot go back to nature, so you stay in a bodily limbo that we could call, I think, zombieism. Let's take a break and we'll come back to zombieism. This is the title page of a book published by Harvard called Moira, Fate, Good and Evil in Greek Thought, and develops through the classical Greeks, the tragedians, the philosophers and so forth, the notion that fate or destiny precedes the gods. Even the gods are subject to destiny. And the reason being is that gods are mythic, whereas fate, destiny, Moira, is natural. And so the question of precedence is that nature always takes precedence over language in terms of process. But language takes transcendence over nature in terms of transformation. That is very powerful. And once one really knows this, you can see why a mythic language must tell its story within certain distributable sequential rules, which are a selection out of the boundlessness of nature. And yet, language on the mythic level is capable of transformation into magic language. Mythic language can be transformed into magic language, and a magic language commands in its process the context in which all forms will then obtain. So that there's not a reversal, and not so much a transversal, but it runs across a diagonal. It's called in logic something contrapunctal. Remember that there's always the presentation of something and its reverse. Then there's the obverse of that, and then there's the contrapositive of that. There's always this fourfold square of possibilities in form. There's always a pair of pairs that characterizes the form, the four corners, the square. The first and third corners, the second and fourth corners relate to each other only if one can move out of sequence, so that those diagonals occur only in a transformational energy. Only then can you have diagonals. And because this is true, because this is the way things are. It's only when there's a quality of transformation that enters into play with the linearity. Only when those two are paired together can one have a universe where there are angles of vision other than the perpendicular right angle. So that the beginnings of a kind of a conscious wisdom, the beginnings of a magic language, the beginnings of a visionary outlook, a visionary process, which is consciousness, come when the linearity has been transformed in such a way that you begin to have an infinity sign and not just a line. Now, one of the ways in which in the mid-1990s we now know that this is the way in which life works is the very structure of the molecule of DNA. The very structure of the molecule of DNA is a double helix, which is the Hermetic caduceus. And that symbol of the Hermetic caduceus came in about 2,000 years ago with Hermes Trismegistus, and is a version of the infinity sign. Now, the molecule of DNA, because it has a double helix, carries energy. If you have a single helix, it does not carry energy. Electromagnetic energy is carried by electron movement, and a single helix will not carry electron movement. But a double helix carries an astonishing electronic movement capacity. If you check the latest issue of Scientific American, May 1995, you'll see that we have the equipment now to gauge in scientific laboratories and physics laboratories how much electronic current a DNA molecule will carry. It was 10,000 times as much as was estimated by previous theory. And previous theory was just a what if it could do. A molecule of DNA can carry more than 1 million electrons per second. There's a tremendous current. So that literally, not just every cell, but every molecule of life lights up when energy is in motion. It is absolutely fantastic. So that the energized plasma of the neural field of consciousness is vast beyond imagination. It's so much beyond imagination that imagination itself becomes like an old-fashioned, rickety mezzotint. Instead of the film version of David Lean's Lawrence of Arabia, you have an old-fashioned color-tinted photograph of T.E. Lawrence, and you say, well, that's Lawrence of Arabia. There's no contest. So that the conscious, creative individual who is free in a boundless cosmos has dimensional capacities that human beings in these other manifest levels never even dreamed of. Literally never could have even dreamed of. So that the future versions of man are unbelievable, literally unbelievable. No one would believe them. Now, when this comes down to our quality now in the education, we're at the third presentation of art. We're talking about how in art, in the artistic experience, in the work of art, in the artist, in this whole realm of art, there's a quality of linearity that we need to keep track of initially, almost like getting the pitch pipe to get us into the right pitch for the octave. And once we have the right pitch and are in the octave, by using that octave in many phases, we can develop a vocabulary which allows us to have a music which has an indefinite number of musical examples. And we can well understand that there are many other scalar forms of music that are possible. And we'll go into some of those when we come to science. As you know, there's music used in the course, and the musical selection for science is one of the most amazing of all musical developments, Schoenberg's second string quartet. In fact, Schoenberg did a lot of his creative work here in Los Angeles, and the USC Musical School is named Schoenberg Hall. And the letters of Schoenberg and Kandinsky are one of the great documents of two titanic creative artists who were at the very same time immersed in magical vision of something completely new, of art forms that human beings had never even dreamed of. And one of the works which we're using in art now is Kandinsky's Concerning the Spiritual in Art. Now, Kandinsky was very, very famous at the time Concerning the Spiritual in Art came out, because he was the first world-class artist to be able to express in a very high-powered discursive language, very conscious yet very artistic language, a reflective intelligence about what kind of visionary activity was the matrix out of which his art came. And Concerning the Spiritual in Art was that publication, was that book. This was 1913. Now, it is amazing because the other world-class artists at this time, exactly at this time, on a creative level with Kandinsky, were doing their best to obscure, by purposeful misuse of discursive language, anybody else profaning this very sacred development. One of the other world-class artists at this time was Max Ernst, who at this very same time, with his group of confrères, was developing Dada and the roots of surrealism in order to confound the profane from ever attempting to even understand what they were doing. And in this, they were Mother Nature's sons and daughters. They were doing what Mother Nature does. Mother Nature does not allow for a regressive radioactive intrusion into her realm. And just the same way the magical realm, the realm of conscious vision, does not allow for a profane intrusion into its realm, no one that has not gone through a transformation, through a realization, may come into this realm. But because Mother Nature is not there to protect, Father Vision is there to protect and refuses admittance. And while no one can get back into Eden, you also cannot get into heaven. And while the gates of Eden may be guarded by an angel with a flaming sword, what guards the gate of heaven is a labyrinth of mirrors so that you cannot tell where the gate is. An infinite diffraction of reality so that there is no way to guess your way in. There's only one way in, and that way is duplicated a trillion times to the nth degree so that there is no way to tell the difference, so that one cannot enter. This quality, which was protected by people like Max Ernst, and perhaps the best great artist of that time that protected it was Picasso. So let's use, just for a second, Kandinsky and Picasso, both in 1913. And remember now, 1913 was a very, very scary year. It's not only a year when income tax was first introduced in the United States, and women got the vote, but it's just before World War I broke out, just before 1914. You have to remember that the tone of the world at that time was British Empire in its Edwardian manner. Not Victorian London, but Edwardian London. And Edwardian London is characterized for all time by a fictional character and by a literary artist. The literary artist is Henry James. And the novels of Henry James characterize the tremendously conscious ambidextrousness of the Victorian British Empire, verged right on the edge of some kind of incomprehensibility. One of the best studies of Henry James ever done by a woman named Dorothea Crook, the subtitle of it is Henry James, The Ordeal of Consciousness. And the other was a fictional character named Sherlock Holmes, who exemplifies the excellence of the Edwardian London British Empire realm right on the edge, because had Professor Moriarty been even the slightest bit lucky, Holmes would never have made it. And in 1913, Kandinsky and Picasso, one striving with spiritual courage to allow for those conscious enough to come into an intelligent understanding through this magical language and concerning the spiritual and art, just what was happening that was so tremendous. Whereas Picasso himself was doing his best to obscure every trace. One of the best studies ever done about that particular aspect of Picasso is this book published by Princeton University Press called Reordering the Universe, Picasso from 1897 to 1914. Patricia Leighton. And she writes in here on page 114. Allow me just to give this just as a paragraph so you can get the picture. Reordering the Universe, Picasso and Anarchism, 1897 to 1914. So familiar now is this personally revelatory artist, so confident are we of finding in his works those clues and signposts of his life, that the Cubist period seems to have been authored by another Picasso. One who, though he may be the most brilliant formal inventor of the century, is sublimely indifferent to content. This disinterested Picasso, however, was largely his own after-the-fact invention. Just like Arthur Conan Doyle wrote and created Sherlock Holmes, Picasso created himself, a version of himself, which has hardly been seen through, except for just a few people in the last few years. He was a very great artist, Picasso. And one of his greatest works of art was Picasso. He was notoriously unforthcoming during the Cubist years, and those who did write in support of the new style, as we have seen, elaborated their own terms in discussing it. Those who wrote about Picasso's development of Cubism wrote about it in development of their own terms that are used about it. Scholars continue to be frustrated by the lack of evidence regarding what specific ideas Picasso or Braque may have contributed to such criticism. When you actually look at the molecular basis of the art historians' descriptions of what they were doing in those days, it's notoriously not there. No, he didn't say that. Oh my God, well, what did he say? He said nothing. He went to great trouble to say nothing. Here is the rest of the paragraph. The only contemporary interviews with Picasso, Gillette Burgess in 1908, not published until 1910, and Marius de Zayas in 1911, are unfortunately both paraphrased. To what extent is, of course, conjectural. And beginning in the 1920s, Picasso finally spoke directly, even, quote, officially, about his Cubist period, his aims, his methods, his relationship to Braque, and in virtually every case, he distorted, exaggerated, and misled those who faithfully repeated his statements as gospel. Picasso's anti-intellectual posture required that he be ruled not only by thoughts or ideas, but by pure, unmediated genius pouring through those famous black eyes. And his egotism required that Braque become a follower, a, quote, Madame Picasso. Braque understood Picasso's magical shamanistic purpose and agreed. No one will ever know. Because someone who has done this for themselves doesn't need to know how we did it. They'll know how they did it. And if they don't know, they have no right in this new realm. They'll have to go back to the tribal levels, beat your drums and do your dances, but you cannot fly with us. So the linearity in Kandinsky and Picasso and Ernst, artists of that time, the linearity began to have this infinite quality that the transformation allowed. And instead of having some kind of line, which would be like a ruler that you could measure things, you began to have a form of eternity that every time it blinked into existence, what occurred was real and measurable only in terms of itself, only in terms of its actual presence. Consciousness is not measurable in any subunit. Its eventual context is zero, and its totality is one. And you can only deal with it in this ultimate paired relationality. This is the only way to deal with it. You cannot take a little consciousness and some corner of the universe and come out with anything. What you come out with every single time is an illusion. And the more that you press it, the more that you fall into delusion. So that is not possible, is not possible to guess your way, to imagine your way, to buffalo your way, to power your way, to demand your way through a transformation. And yet the transformation will not happen until there's this kind of continuity, until the distribution of the mythos, the narrative line, has every little compartment completely filled, and only then, when they all overflow together, it's rather like holding the ice cube tray under the tap. And as long as there's one little compartment to be filled, you can keep moving it around. But there comes a time when the whole tray overflows. Transformation is like that. A transformation happens naturally when all of the little cubic areas are filled. Now, if you continue along a narrative line, continue to make more little cubic spaces, then you have to fill them too. So one keeps running into this kind of a paradox. In advanced yoga, in deep prayer, in fantastically high Dharma, one realizes that the more that you continue to outline possibilities imaginatively, the more you have to fill them. And so one learns judiciousness. One learns, as they used to call, humility. Yes, in your flailing egotism, you can outline universe after universe. You could put out a line of neurocomics that would go forever. But it just means that you have to defer until you've fulfilled all of that of coming to your realization. That's fine. How many million lifetimes would you like to have? You can have as many as you want. And when you've used up this universe, there are many other universes. You can go on as long as you wish. So the judiciousness that comes in finally is to realize, wait a minute. Yes, I can do this, but I would like to transform into off this plane, off this level where one is just making more ice cubes. It doesn't matter whether it's for your drink or someone else's drink. One would like to overflow. One would like to experience this kind of waterfall quality that realization is. Not a big Niagara Falls, not a Zambezi Falls, but a kind of like an overflow everywhere. That quality of transformation leads to vision. And out of vision is the first plasma process where the opportunity of the reality of the person raises its head in this universe and looks around and wishes to be born. The seed of the person is there in that magical transformation, in that vision. And the person, for the very first time, to use an alchemical term that's become metaphorical, the person for the first time can be assayed as a realistic project. That's the first time that one can be, quote, serious about being who you are. Up until then, there were many masks, but no one. So when we come to that particular quality on the 23rd page of our outline of our education, vision is consciousness. We are considering vision as a transformation medium. In any concern with understanding form, we make a symbolic shape. For example, the mandala, the symbolic wheel. What is captured in this focus are all the elements and relations that go to create the centering synthesis. Here, the initial amulet function of the symbol comes into play. This is to protect meaning by sealing it safely in form. The mandala is at first an amulet, encasing, in presented patterning, the full meaning structure that developed during its life career from the natural base, from nature to symbol, and all in between. The self can be seen, presented now to consciousness, in this case as a mandala. But vision as a transformation medium is directly related to nature, which is a transformational medium in itself. They are, in fact, together a continuity. And notice now that the plasma process of nature is continuous with the plasma process of vision, because the plasma process of language, quote, in between, maintains and passes on that continuity. Put in old-fashioned, 2,000-year-old wisdom language, magic only happens because nature is continuous of its extendability in language. Without language, magic is not possible. But remember what we talked about last week, how at any one time, in any one frame of the real, there are only a pair of pairs. There's only a square that can be kept track of at any one time. It's true that all of the corners are there, but one can only keep track of any 4 at the same time. So that when you have the square of integration, nature, ritual, myth, symbol, and you go beyond that to the extent that the quintessence of magic comes into play, to the extent that the alchemy of transformation happens, and the 5th corner, what would be the 5th corner, comes into play, the 1st corner phases out. And so to the extent that vision obtains, nature phases itself out, not out of reality, but out of the perspective that we keep track of. So that eventually when vision is fulfilled, vision displaces nature. And you have ritual, myth, symbol, vision. That is very scary, very, very scary, because from the very beginning, what beginning? The boundlessness of the no beginning, nature has always been there. In terms of this planet, 4.5 billion years. In terms of this universe, anywhere to 10 to 20 billion years. Nature has always been there in the 1st corner. Always. But when consciousness comes into play, that aspect of nature has to be let go of to the extent that it is displaced. And that can only happen, it can only happen when one allows it to be. And you can't allow it to be in a willful way. You can't allow it to be in a power way. I'm going to allow it. One has to allow it in the sense of surrendering, of letting it be. And to the extent that someone realizes that the final stage of integration is surrender, not surrender as in give up, but surrender in gifting up. Gifting up. The emphasis not on giving up, but on giving up. There's a whole difference in that. Giving up is a defeat. It's a form of suicide. Whereas gifting up is a form of what used to be called in Buddhist India dana. The translation of that is charity or giving. Giving is probably the better translation. But charity, not in the sense of charity that a Carnegie gives so much money to so-and-so, but in the old Maimonidean code. The Maimonidean code was that the highest charity is that no one knows who gave and no one knows who received. On that level, giving is perfectible. It was one of the old paramitas. In Mahayana Buddhism, there are only 6 actions that are perfectible, and the very first one is giving. Patience is perfectible. Giving is perfectible. And there are 4 others. These activities are perfectible. And so when we come to that transformation, we saw in our education, we looked at the way in which there are some very peculiar qualities that come into place. On page 28 and 29 is the narrative sequence that happens parenthetically on both sides of realization. The first parenthesis is acceptance. The second parenthesis is absorbing experience. You can read them for yourself. The last stage of integration is this acceptance, the surrender of acceptance. And the first stage of differentiation is for absorbing experience, the plasma of absorbing experience, the plasma of the visionary magic going into motion. And just as existence is the very first objectivity that comes out of the matrix of nature, the very first objectivity that comes out of the plasma of vision is the person. So that persons have an extraordinary quality in this universe. Absolutely extraordinary quality. Persons are as important to reality as existence. And one can draw a diagonal anywhere across the sphere of the real. And anywhere that one draws that diagonal, the parentheses that allow for a narrative line to be true are that existence and person are the beginning of the story and the culmination of the story. This is one of the great measuring bars of wholeness. It doesn't have sub-measurable units on it. It is only what it is. And it is, truthfully, very objective. It begins with an existence, and it ends with a person. Now, it's true that there is a zero base before that existence beginning. And there are several very interesting phases after. But nevertheless, in between that is quite real, extraordinarily real. The objective phase of existence, we learned that the best designation of it is ritual. Not just doing what is prescribed, but doing what you do. Doing. Being mindful, being attentive to what you're actually doing. It's like a great chef who follows a recipe. And the recipe is not necessarily something just written down, but it could be encoded by something else. I knew a very, very wonderful Indian woman, very high-class Punjabi, who could cook better than anyone in terms of Northern Indian food, but could never write a cookbook because she cooked in terms of smell. And at each stage of each dish, she knew when it smelled right and it was ready for the next stage. And there was no notation for smell discursively applicable enough for her to write a cookbook. It was a very interesting thing. Somebody in the future, in the 21st century, will come up with a notation for the sophisticated degrees of smell and be able to write such a cookbook. Ted Shawn, who was with Ruth St. Denis in the development of dance, perfected a notation that later on came into play with some other wonderful thinkers, so that movement has a notation. And there were whole developments of highly intelligent people who went into the basis of acting, the mechanics of moving for acting, based on a very large but nevertheless limited number of possible scenarios of the octaves of movement, notational movement. There are 216 possibilities. It's interesting because in Chinese, there are 216 radicals to the Chinese character set. Amazing. Just like the structure of DNA folds into the I Ching hexagrams in perfect way. It's not only that there are mysteries because we don't know, there are mysteries because we do know. The mysteries of integration are because we don't know, but the mysteries of differential universe are because we do know. And because we do know, that's why they're mysterious. And the realm of the person belongs there. One is a mysterious person, not because one doesn't know, but because one does know who you are. What could be more mysterious than a being knowing who they are in a boundlessness, in a differential infinitude, and yet still knowing exactly who they are? That is pretty damn mysterious. We have to have a new swear word. It's pretty salvational mysterious. Nothing damnable about it. In the Bhagavad Gita, that person is called Purusha. In Zarathustra, it's called Sarosha. There are all kinds of names for that figure that emerges. Like Tolkien said, the best fairy tales are those where the story is completely finished in a tragic mode. There's no doubt whatsoever that evil obtained and everything is over. And yet there are more pages to the story. Oh! Why? Because evil is limited to its storyline. That's the damnable thing about it. That's the hell about it. Because the Satan, notice the neuter particle. In Hebrew, one always uses the neutered particle because the Satan is a neuter person, neither male nor female. That's why the Satan is free to pull so much shit. It's neither male nor female. It's an it. Incapable of personhood, incapable of transformation. But we, each one of us, is capable of transformation, and we can leave our dust behind. Not only eat my dust, but other phrases are possible. All the demons can do is gnash their teeth and grip the vanished air where you were just a second ago, fulfilling that wonderful old Irish toast, may you be in heaven a half hour before the devil knows you're dead. You're home free. Acceptance and absorbing experience are parentheses where symbol and vision come together and whole, they cup, almost, I guess, whose corporate hand has these? Allstate or something? You're in good hands? Well, even more than Sears Corporation, you're in good hands with God. Very good hands. Because in that space, in that cup of the paired palms, in that space is a possibility that evil cannot even dream of. Cannot even dream of. The biggest threat that the Satan as a neutered figure offers is that you will be reduced to oblivion, to nothingness, to a void. And the yoga says, oh boy. And the devils always say, what? Was that guy Ray Walton, my favorite Martian that was in the film of Damn Yankees? Arr! Arr! He got free. He took my threat seriously and did it. Arr! It's all your fault, Vera. This quality where evil cannot follow through a transformation. Evil does not transform. That's why it's evil. Cannot transform. Why? Because it bases its whole sense of power on the approaching of nothingness. And the actual achieving of nothingness shorts it out. Has no more to threaten with. Has no more power. You can ground evil in the void. So no matter how corrupt a planet is, in its movement in the vast spaces of the universe, and they're truly vast, they're unbelievably vast. We use now as a focal point in extragalactic astronomy the Virgo cluster, which is some 50 million light years away, and it's just in the neighborhood. You don't even get accuracy on certain levels of 1995 astronomical computation. For instance, trying to keep track of two neutron stars that are rotating around each other and coalesce and come to a vanishing black hole together. The measurements only become accurate on the scale of 3 billion years or more. The shitnik devils on any individual planets are completely outclassed by this scale of God's grandeur. Those demons are forever chained to the rocks of the place in which they are. Not only are demons limited to the place in which they are, the gods are limited to a place in which they are. So that the whole celebration of worship of a mythological god is that one has to do it in a certain definite place. The cult of this or that god is only really effective at this exact place. Zeus at Dodona, Apollo at Delphi. Now, while there may be franchise places for specialized functions, Apollo had a place at Delos for money. But no one would think of consulting the Delphic oracle at Delphi. Only the bank ledgers. Gods and demons are limited to the geographical place because only that geographical place has the beginning existence which their whole experiential matrix is based upon. And without that, they no longer exist. Whereas we are of such a nature because we're transformable. We can go anywhere in the universe and be at home and be real. And even a transcendental geography like the classical angelologies, angels can only exist in specific designated presences. That's all. Only in that abstract realm, the geography of abstract presence. I can only be at certain junctures and that's it. Gabriel can play his high C, but only at that designated messenger spot. Only at that time and at that spot. Whereas we are free to be who we are throughout every universe that's possible or not possible. And for us to cage ourselves in some kind of pentiati, prejudices, and limitations that don't even function beyond normal single transformational level is just an exercise in futility. So an education like this is not only indispensable, it's basic. For next week, those who are reading Virgil as the synthesizing work for the whole second year, remember that your place in Virgil is going to be at the end of Book 5. Book 4 was about Dido and Aeneas and about how Dido makes a magical curse by burning an effigy of Virgil and burning herself on that effigy, on that pseudo-marriage couch which they had. And the only way in which that can be released is for Virgil to go to a visionary magical realm where another woman can release him. And the release from Dido's magical curse can only come if Virgil goes to visit the Sibyl of Cumae. And so while it may seem like a boring little episode, the end of Book 5, where they have these fantastic athletic games, and they do all these men's things, and because they're left out, the women burn the ships so that they can't go anywhere. Fortunately, some rains come and a few ships survive. And Virgil picks only those people who are willing to go on. And anyone who's not willing to go on is let to stay there and left behind. And those who go on immediately to one of the most terrifying places there is, the Sibyl of Cumae. So I'll talk a little bit about that next week. But if you're reading Virgil, read the boring little section of a couple of pages, because it's this boring little hiatus in between two great magical episodes. Book 4 and Book 6 of the Aeneid are the most famous books in the whole work. And it's just like this in your education. If there's a Saturday where it seems that not much is happening in terms of the class, be a little generous, because it may be a necessary hiatus between two explosive highlights. So just endure with a little largesse and realize that I'm not working with any kind of notes, really. I'm doing this extempore too. Not that I'm a short order cook, but that, like Mina Vora, I cook by smell, and I can only tell when the next stage is ready when I get there. I don't know ahead of time when I am. But it looks like next week should be, well, in the Midwest they used to use the phrase a barn burner. Thank you.